People often called me a gentle and composed Omega, the kind noble families whispered about during tea gatherings and palace banquets, the kind who knew when to lower his eyes, how to speak softly, and how to seem refined without trying too hard. According to the endless chatter of ministers' wives and eager matchmakers, I was worthy of marrying a prince. That would have been flattering if the compliments hadn't followed me around like an annoying little bird that refused to stop chirping. My name is Elias Thorne, the fifth son of the Prime Minister, the King's right-hand man. That position sounds impressive until you realize being the fifth son means four older brothers are already busy being successful and responsible, while I just had to exist quietly and marry well enough not to embarrass the family name. Naturally, I had done an excellent job at that, at least until that morning. I woke slowly, sunlight slipping through the carved wooden lattice of my window. The scent of plum blossoms drifted lazily into the room. For a brief moment, everything felt peaceful and ordinary. But then the door burst open. "Fifth young master," my maid exclaimed breathlessly, nearly tripping over her own feet as she rushed inside, clutching a bundle of freshly pressed robes like a soldier running onto a battlefield. I blinked at her. It was far too early for this level of chaos. "What is it?" I asked, still half buried under my blanket, speaking with the calm dignity expected of a noble Omega who had been praised his entire life for being composed. "You must wake up immediately," she said urgently, placing the robes beside my bed while adjusting the hairpin that had come loose during her dramatic entrance. "Your husband-to-be will be arriving today to see you." I stared at her. My brain refused to process those words. I sat up so quickly my blanket fell to the floor. "My husband-to-be?" I repeated. Then she smiled brightly and said the words that nearly stopped my heart. "It is the Ghost General." Silence filled the room. The Ghost General. Out of every man in the kingdom, out of every noble family, respectable scholar, decent merchant, or even a hard-working farmer who would have happily grown cabbages in peace, it had to be him. The man whose name alone made soldiers straighten their backs. The man who returned from battlefields so blood-soaked that people whispered spirits followed him home. And he was coming here to see me as his future spouse. I slowly covered my face with both hands. Then I jumped out of bed, threw on a robe, and marched out with the determination of someone about to challenge fate itself. It might have been foolish, but at the time it felt reasonable. If there was anyone who could tell me exactly what was happening, that would be my mother. I found my mother in the inner courtyard, calmly overseeing breakfast preparations. The moment she saw my expression, she sighed, the way mothers do when they realize their child is about to say something dramatic. "Mother," I said, bowing quickly before getting straight to the point. "I cannot marry the Ghost General." She did not even look surprised. Instead, she calmly lifted her teacup and took a small sip. "Why not?" "Because he is terrifying," I replied. She set her teacup down gently and told me the marriage had been arranged by the Queen Mother herself. The Ghost General had agreed, and my father had approved. "This marriage cannot be cancelled," she said. A long silence followed. I slowly sat down beside her, feeling the weight of my elegant reputation collapsing. All my life people had praised me, and apparently being perfect had led me straight into the arms of the most terrifying alpha in the kingdom. I sighed heavily. Then an idea began to form. If the marriage could not be cancelled, perhaps it could be ruined. What if the Ghost General decided he did not want to marry me? People thought I was the most gentle and refined Omega in the kingdom. But what if he discovered something different? What if he met an Omega who was clumsy, troublesome, rude, embarrassing, and completely unsuitable for a man with such a fearsome reputation? Surely even the Ghost General would reconsider. I stood up, determination filling my chest. If the marriage could not be cancelled, then I would simply make him regret choosing me. I prepared myself to meet the most feared man in the kingdom. After all, if I annoyed him enough, surely even the Ghost General would run away. People often said the ghost general looked like a man carved from ice. A ruthless alpha whose name alone could silence an entire court hall. A man who walked through wars as if death itself had chosen him as its favorite companion. Because of those terrifying rumors, I had imagined someone monstrous, towering and brutal, with a face scarred beyond recognition, someone whose presence would make the air feel heavy and dangerous. Unfortunately for my carefully planned rebellion, that was not the man who arrived at our residence. When the gates of our manor opened and Lord Cale Blackwood stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was not fear, not brutality, not even the intimidating aura everyone had described, but rather a quiet and terrifying elegance that made him look less like a battlefield monster and more like a dark prince who had simply wandered out of a war instead of a palace. He was tall, far taller than any noble I had ever seen up close, with long black hair tied neatly behind him and sharp, composed features that somehow looked both cold and impossibly handsome at the same time. His dark robes were trimmed with subtle silver embroidery, and the faint shadow of battle seemed to cling to him like an invisible cloak. When he walked into the courtyard, every servant immediately lowered their head as if an emperor had just arrived. I watched him from behind the wooden screen of the corridor, and for one very dangerous moment I forgot to breathe. So this was the man people feared across the kingdom? This was the terrifying ghost general? Why was he so handsome? I quickly slapped my own cheek. Focus, Elias. This is not the time to admire enemy territory. I had a mission. My plan was simple, brilliant, and absolutely necessary. I needed to make him regret choosing me. If the marriage could not be cancelled from my side, then the ghost general himself would have to reject me. I straightened my robes and whispered to myself with determination, "Stand on business, Elias." Meanwhile, in the main hall, my father had already welcomed Lord Cale with a level of respect usually reserved for royalty, personally escorting him inside while servants hurried around preparing a banquet so elaborate that one might think the emperor himself was coming for dinner. Large dishes soon covered the table, steamed fish glazed in golden sauce, fragrant bowls of rice, roasted duck, shredded meat delicately seasoned with spices, several plates of vegetables arranged like works of art. The entire table looked less like a meal and more like a small festival. My father gestured politely. "Lord Blackwood, please sit." Lord Cale nodded calmly. "Prime Minister Thorne, you are too kind." His voice was deep and steady, carrying the quiet authority of someone used to giving commands on a battlefield rather than attending family banquets. Servants poured tea. My mother smiled politely. Everyone behaved with the kind of careful elegance expected when entertaining a man who could probably conquer half the kingdom if he felt like it. The moment I stepped into the hall, Lord Cale's gaze shifted toward me. Our eyes met for a brief second. The room felt strangely quiet, and to my absolute shock, the terrifying ghost general gave me a small, gentle smile. My heart did something extremely embarrassing inside my chest. This is emotional manipulation, I told myself. I immediately ignored him. Without even acknowledging his existence, I walked straight past him and casually dropped into the empty seat beside him, as if I were attending a normal family dinner and not meeting my terrifying future husband. The entire table froze. My father cleared his throat. "Elias." I pretended to focus on the dishes. My mother smiled tightly. I reached for my chopsticks. "Fifth son," my father said slowly, "you should greet Lord Blackwood properly." I picked up a dumpling. My mother added gently, "He is your future husband." I chewed thoughtfully. "No, he's not." Silence exploded across the table. Even the servants stopped breathing. My father's eyebrow twitched dangerously. "What did you say?" I said no, I replied calmly. Before anyone could react further, I leaned slightly toward Lord Cale, reached over with my chopsticks, grabbed a slice of shredded meat directly from his chopsticks, and placed it into my mouth like someone who had completely forgotten what manners were. The entire hall froze. No one spoke. I slowly chewed. Across from me, my parents stared in absolute horror. Their perfectly raised Omega son had just stolen food from the Ghost General's chopsticks like a shameless bandit. My father looked ready to dig a grave for our family reputation. But the person I had truly been watching was Lord Kale. I was patiently waiting for him to stand up and declare the marriage impossible. Instead, the Ghost General calmly picked up another piece of shredded meat, and then gently placed it into the bowl in front of me. "Eat slowly," he said quietly. I blinked. This was not how my plan was supposed to go. I narrowed my eyes. Fine. If that did not work, I would escalate. Without warning, I lifted one leg onto the chair, leaned over the table like a bandit who had just discovered treasure, grabbed an entire chicken leg, and began eating it with absolutely zero elegance. My mother's soul visibly left her body. "Elias," she smacked my arm with her chopsticks. "Do you want to disgrace us?" The servants looked terrified. My father closed his eyes in silent despair. My mother quickly turned toward Lord Kale with a deeply embarrassed expression. "Lord Blackwood, please forgive him. This child has been spoiled since childhood, so he lacks proper manners." I continued chewing the chicken leg proudly. Across the table, Lord Kale watched me quietly. Then he smiled, not angrily, not mockingly, just calmly. He placed his chopsticks down and stood. "The wedding will be held in 3 days," he said. My chicken leg froze in midair. 3 days? He turned to my parents and bowed politely. "I will take my leave." Then the terrifying Ghost General of the Empire simply walked out of the hall as calmly as he had arrived. The door closed. Silence filled the room. I slowly lowered the chicken leg and stared blankly at the doorway where Lord Kale had just disappeared. My brilliant plan, my perfectly executed disgraceful behavior, had completely failed. And in 3 days, I was going to marry the Ghost General. The day after the Ghost General visited our residence, the entire Thorn household seemed to move around me, as if I were some fragile object that might break at any moment. Servants whispering more quietly than usual, my mother watching me with a careful gaze, and my father pretending to read documents while occasionally glancing in my direction, like a man silently praying his troublesome fifth son would not destroy the family reputation before the wedding even arrived. Unfortunately for them, that was exactly what I was planning to do. However, before I could begin my next brilliant act of rebellion, I discovered something far more frightening. Specifically, rumors about Lord Kale, the Ghost General himself. It started while I was walking through the side courtyard that afternoon, lazily pretending to admire the lotus pond, while secretly avoiding the etiquette instructor my mother had hired to prepare me for married life. I overheard 2 servants whispering near the garden wall with a kind of excited fear that only appears when people are discussing someone both terrifying and fascinating. "They say the Ghost General once fought an entire battalion alone," one of them murmured. "That cannot be true," the other replied nervously. "It is true," the first insisted, lowering his voice further. "My cousin serves in the Northern Army, and he said the general stood in the middle of the battlefield surrounded by enemies, and when the fighting ended, none of them were left standing." I slowed my steps. "None?" the second servant asked quietly. The wind rustled softly through the bamboo. "And they say he barely sleeps. He keeps his sword beside him even when resting. Soldiers who have served under him say, when he enters the battlefield, his eyes look so cold it feels like death itself has arrived." A small chill crawled down my spine. "That is why people call him the Ghost General," the servant finished. I immediately turned around and walked away. Back in my room, I sat down slowly. So this was the man I was supposed to spend the rest of my life with? A battlefield ghost, a terrifying alpha whose enemies disappeared like fallen leaves in winter? I swallowed. For a brief moment, I considered fainting dramatically and pretending to be ill for the next several months. Unfortunately, the wedding was already approaching, and my family would probably drag me to the ceremony even if I arrived unconscious. Which meant there was only one solution. If the ghost general was truly as terrifying as the rumors suggested, then I needed to make him reject me before the wedding. With renewed determination, I immediately began my second plan. If I could not shock him with shameless behavior during the banquet, then I would become the most lazy, arrogant, and uncooperative Omega in the entire kingdom. The next morning, when my etiquette instructor arrived with scrolls, posture guides, and a very serious expression prepared to teach me proper conduct as the wife of a powerful general, I simply rolled over on my bed and pretended to still be asleep. When she cleared her throat loudly, I ignored her. When she called my name, I buried my face deeper into the pillow. My mother herself came to check why the lesson had not begun, and found her supposedly elegant and gentle son lying across the bed like a lazy cat that had absolutely no intention of moving. "Elias," she said slowly. I waved a hand lazily. "I am tired. You slept all night." "I am still tired," I said. The etiquette instructor looked horrified. My mother looked like she might personally throw me into the lotus pond. This pattern continued for the rest of the day. Whenever someone tried to teach me proper greetings, I forgot them. Whenever someone reminded me to sit properly, I slouched. Whenever someone told me to walk elegantly, I walked as if I had suddenly forgotten how legs worked. By evening, my mother's patience had completely evaporated, and somewhere between my dramatic laziness and my refusal to practice even the most basic manners, she finally reached the conclusion that something had to be done. That night, a letter was quietly sent from our residence addressed to Lord Cale Blackwood. Inside, my mother politely explained that her fifth son was being extremely uncooperative with all wedding preparations, and that she feared his stubborn behavior might cause embarrassment during the ceremony. It didn't bother me, not until the next day. The day before the wedding began with a lot of noise. From the moment the sun rose, the front gates of the Thorne residence became unusually busy. Servants hurried back and forth. Guards moved large chests across the courtyard, and the sound of horses filled the morning air. Curious, I stepped outside and immediately froze. Outside the gates stood a large convoy of carriages, each one carrying neatly stacked boxes tied with red silk ribbons, while soldiers wearing the insignia of the Northern Army stood beside them like silent statues. At the center of it all was a messenger. He bowed respectfully the moment he saw me. "These are gifts from Lord Blackwood," he said calmly. Servants quickly began opening the boxes. Inside them were treasures, expensive silks, beautiful jade ornaments, rare medicines, elegant jewelry, and even delicate hairpins crafted with incredible detail. The courtyard slowly filled with whispers of amazement. I stared at the gifts. The messenger bowed again and said, "Lord Blackwood asked that these be delivered to the fifth young master." Then he calmly added the message. "The general also hopes the fifth young master will cooperate with the wedding preparations, so that neither family will fall into the displeasure of the royal court." Silence followed his words, because everyone in the kingdom knew what that meant. This marriage had been arranged by the Queen Mother. If it failed, it would not simply be embarrassing. It could place both families under the royal blacklist. My father, the Prime Minister, could lose his position. Our entire household could suffer. The courtyard slowly emptied as servants carried the gifts inside, leaving me alone beneath the quiet morning sky. For a long moment, I simply stood there. Then I slowly sat down on the stone steps. My plan had been to embarrass the ghost general, make him reject me, and escape the marriage. But now, for the first time, I realized something I had not considered before. This marriage was not only about me. It was about my family, about my father who had served the kingdom faithfully for years, about my mother who had always protected me even when I caused trouble. If the wedding failed because of my stubbornness, they would be the ones to suffer. A quiet sigh escaped my lips. I looked at the silk ribbons tied around the gift boxes, then up at the sky. So that is how it is, I murmured softly. For the first time since this entire disaster began, I stopped trying to run away from it. Slowly I stood. If marrying the ghost general would protect my family, then I would do it. Even if the man waiting for me was a terrifying alpha feared across the entire kingdom. I straightened my robes, and for the first time since hearing about the marriage, I finally decided to accept it. The morning of my wedding arrived far sooner than I would have liked, bringing with it a strange mixture of quiet determination and nervous dread that settled heavily in my chest. Because although I had already decided the previous day that I would accept this marriage for the sake of my family, that decision did not magically erase the terrifying reality that by the end of this day, I would officially become the spouse of the most feared alpha in the entire kingdom. Naturally, my mother took the responsibility of preparing me for the ceremony with the seriousness of a general preparing a soldier for war. Servants filled my room before sunrise, layering luxurious silk robes over my shoulders. Deep crimson fabric embroidered with delicate golden patterns that shimmered under the soft morning light. My long hair was brushed, tied, and decorated with elegant ornaments that made me look far more noble and composed than I actually felt. When I finally stood in front of the mirror, even I had to pause for a moment. The reflection staring back at me looked stunning. Apparently, if one was going to marry the ghost general, one had to at least look impressive while doing so. Outside the manor, a luxurious wedding carriage had already arrived to escort me to the palace. The carriage itself was decorated with red silk ribbons and golden carvings that reflected the sunlight beautifully, while guards and attendants stood beside it with respectful expressions, making it very clear that this wedding was not just a family event, but something the entire court was paying close attention to. My mother adjusted the collar of my robe one final time. "Behave yourself today," she whispered quietly. I nodded. For once, I truly intended to. The journey to the palace passed in a blur of nervous thoughts and racing heartbeat, and by the time the carriage finally arrived at the grand hall where the ceremony would be held, I realized that the wedding was far more elaborate than I had imagined. The hall was already filled with nobles, ministers, scholars, and officials. Their voices blended together into a low murmur of excitement and curiosity as they gathered to witness the marriage of the empire's most feared general. At the front of the hall, seated on an elevated throne with a calm but incredibly observant gaze, was the person responsible for this entire situation, the Queen Mother. Her presence alone made the atmosphere feel heavier, like the air itself was reminding everyone that this marriage carried the blessing and the expectations of the royal family. I lowered my gaze slightly. Today was absolutely not the day to try anything foolish. So for the first time since this whole situation began, I behaved exactly the way everyone expected me to. I stood calmly, walked properly, greeted the nobles politely. If anyone watching had known how disastrously I had behaved just days earlier, they probably would have fainted from shock. Then suddenly, the murmurs in the hall grew louder because the groom had arrived. When Lord Cale Blackwood stepped into the hall, the entire atmosphere shifted instantly. He was dressed in a magnificent wedding outfit of deep red silk embroidered with intricate golden dragons, the fabric flowing elegantly with every step he took, while his long dark hair was tied neatly behind him with a gold crown ornament that reflected the light beautifully. For a moment, the terrifying ghost general did not look like a warrior who had conquered battlefields. He looked like something straight out of a fairy tale, a dark prince, handsome, powerful, completely impossible to ignore. My eyes widened slightly before I quickly forced myself to look away. I refused to be mesmerized by him. That would be extremely embarrassing. But unfortunately for me, Lord Cale had already noticed me standing there. His gaze softened, and then he walked toward me, and when he finally reached me, he gently took my hand. The contact was warm, unexpectedly careful. "Come," he said quietly. My heart suddenly began beating far too fast. Together we walked toward the front of the hall where the Queen Mother sat, watching everything with sharp interest. The entire room was silent as hundreds of eyes followed our movements across the polished floor. Unfortunately, the moment Lord Kale held my hand, my body decided to betray me. My heartbeat grew louder, my palms felt warm, and despite the hall being pleasantly cool, I began to feel slightly nervous. By the time we reached the steps of the throne, I was quietly sweating, which was deeply embarrassing because Lord Kale noticed. He glanced at me briefly. Then, without any hesitation, he reached into his sleeve and pulled out a small, clean-faced towel. Before I could even react, he gently lifted his hand and wiped the faint sweat from my forehead. The action was simple and careful, almost affectionate. For a moment, the entire hall went silent. Then suddenly, the crowd exploded into excited whispers. "Did you see that? The ghost general helped his bride. I never thought he could be so gentle." Perhaps the rumors about him were exaggerated. Some nobles even laughed in pleasant surprise, apparently witnessing the terrifying ghost general behave like a considerate husband was the most shocking event of the year. Meanwhile, I stood there completely frozen. My face felt warm, and my heart was beating like a drum. Lord Kale calmly returned the towel to his sleeve as if he had done nothing unusual. Then the ceremony continued. We bowed respectfully before the Queen Mother. She gave her blessing with quiet dignity, and finally the vows were spoken. The words echoed clearly through the grand hall, sealing the marriage under the watchful eyes of nobles, ministers, and the royal court itself. By the time the ceremony ended, a strange realization slowly settled in my chest. There was no more pretending, no more escape plans, no more ridiculous attempts to sabotage the wedding, because now I was officially married. Elias Thorne, the supposedly gentle Omega of the Prime Minister's household, had become the spouse of the infamous ghost general, Lord Kale Blackwood. When the wedding ceremony finally ended and the nobles began leaving the grand hall in lively discussion about the surprisingly gentle behavior of the infamous ghost general, the moment I had been avoiding all day quietly arrived. The moment I would officially leave my family home and follow my new husband to his residence. My father stood beside me with the calm composure of a man who had spent his entire life navigating the complicated world of the royal court, offering Lord Kale a respectful nod that carried both gratitude and silent trust. My mother looked like she had just watched her only child being sent off to war. Tears formed in her eyes the moment she looked at me. "Take care of yourself," she said softly. I blinked, then sighed. Honestly, she was acting like I was leaving the kingdom forever. "Mother," I said patiently, "I will come visiting soon." She sniffed. "I live in the same capital city." Her tears did not stop. I rubbed my temples. Why did everyone keep assuming the ghost general was going to eat me alive the moment we reached his house? Behind me, Lord Kale stood quietly, giving my family enough time to say their farewells without interrupting, his calm presence somehow making the chaotic emotional moment feel strangely stable. Eventually, my father cleared his throat. "I wish you a happy married life," he said, patting my shoulder. I took one last look at my parents, then turned and followed Lord Kale outside. A magnificent black horse was waiting for us at the palace gates. Lord Kale mounted the horse effortlessly, then extended his hand toward me. For a moment I hesitated, but the entire palace courtyard was watching, so I took his hand. He lifted me up, easily settling me in front of him on the saddle as if I weighed absolutely nothing, which was both impressive and slightly humiliating. The moment the horse began moving, I suddenly became very aware of two things. First, Lord Kale was very close. Second, my heart had once again decided to beat like a drum inside my chest. The steady rhythm of the horse's steps carried us through the capital streets, while the wind brushed lightly against my face. Although the ride itself was calm and quiet, the awareness of Lord Kale sitting directly behind me made the entire journey feel strangely intense. His arm occasionally moved slightly to guide the horse. Every time it did, my heartbeat sped up again. This is ridiculous. I faced him during the wedding without fainting. Why is sitting on a horse suddenly more terrifying? Fortunately, the journey did not last long. Soon the horse slowed to a stop. I looked up and immediately blinked in surprise. Before us stood an enormous residence surrounded by elegant stone walls and tall gates carved with intricate patterns. The entrance decorated with tasteful lanterns and carefully arranged gardens that made the entire place look more like a noble estate than the home of a terrifying war general. This was not what I had imagined at all. In my mind, the ghost general's residence had been filled with dark corridors, ominous lanterns, and possibly a few ghost statues standing in corners just to maintain the frightening reputation. Instead, the place looked warm and welcoming. It almost felt like the home of a scholar rather than a man who had conquered battlefields. We dismounted from the horse, and the moment Lord Kale stepped through the gates, rows of servants standing inside the courtyard immediately bowed respectfully. "Welcome home, my lord," they echoed loudly. Then their gazes shifted toward me, their new master's spouse. One of the older servants smiled warmly. "May our master's home be filled with happiness and many children." The other servants nodded in agreement. I scoffed immediately. "Children? Let us slow down," I said dryly, crossing my arms slightly. "There will be no children for now." Several servants looked surprised. One of them quickly tried to hide a laugh. Lord Kale said nothing, which somehow made the situation even more awkward. Before the conversation could become any stranger, a middle-aged female servant stepped forward with a respectful bow. "Young Master Elias," she said politely, "please follow me." I glanced at Lord Kale. He simply nodded slightly, so I followed her through the residence. The interior of the mansion was just as impressive as the exterior, with wide corridors, elegant wooden screens, and softly glowing lanterns that created a calm and comfortable atmosphere. Eventually, the servant stopped in front of a door. "This will be your room," she explained. Slowly, I looked down the corridor, then back at the door, then at the servant. A small realization dawned on me. This room was completely separate from Lord Kale's. For a moment I stood there quietly, then stepped inside. The room was spacious and beautifully arranged, with soft bedding, polished wooden furniture, and a large window that allowed gentle evening light to fill the space. I looked around, then sat down on the edge of the bed. I had assumed the ghost general would insist that we share a room immediately, which would have made this entire situation significantly more awkward. Instead, he had given me my own space. I leaned back slightly and exhaled. Maybe living with the ghost general would not be as terrifying as I had imagined. At the very least, I could sleep peacefully in my own room. I didn't know what time it was when Lord Kale left the mansion the next morning. Apparently, before leaving, the ghost general had walked to my room, the servant said, and stood outside my door for a moment before gently pushing it open. I, however, knew absolutely nothing about it, because I was sleeping like someone who had no responsibilities in life. According to the servants, Lord Kale stepped inside quietly and saw me sprawled across the bed in a very ungraceful position, my blanket half on the floor, one arm hanging off the side of the bed, as if I had lost a battle against my own mattress. He apparently stood there for a moment, then quietly pulled the blanket back over me. The ghost general, the man feared across the entire kingdom, tucked his newly married Omega into bed like a careless child. After that, he left. But before he rode out for his mission, he left instructions. "Take care of him while I am gone." That was what he told the servants, and then he left the mansion with his soldiers. When I finally woke up that morning, sunlight was already spilling through the window and hitting directly into my eyes. I groaned and buried my face into the pillow. After a few minutes of dramatic suffering, I slowly sat up and stretched, and noticed a folded letter sitting neatly on the table beside my bed. I got out of bed and walked over to pick it up. The paper was thick and elegant, the handwriting beautiful and neat. I unfolded the letter and began to read. The message was simple. He wrote that he had to leave early in the morning for a military mission and would return in a few days. He told me to eat properly, rest, and stay safe while he was gone. That was it. No long explanations, no unnecessary words, just a calm message written in neat, disciplined handwriting. I stared at the letter for a moment longer, then placed it back on the table. For some reason, I felt a strange warmth in my chest, though I quickly ignored it. Instead, I stretched again and muttered to myself, well, if he told me to eat properly, I guess I should listen. After all, it would be a waste to starve in such a huge mansion filled with food. Still, as I got ready for the day, my eyes drifted back to the letter on the table. I had married the most feared man in the kingdom, but somehow, that made the mansion feel a little less empty without him. 2 days passed quietly. After Lord Kale left for his mission, the servants treated me with careful respect. The meals were always prepared on time, and the courtyard remained calm under the soft glow of the lanterns. Every night, I found myself looking toward the main gate whenever I walked through the courtyard, wondering if the ghost general had returned, which was ridiculous. I had spent weeks trying to escape this marriage, yet now I was standing in his mansion waiting for him like some overly obedient spouse. So naturally, I pretended that wasn't what I was doing. On the evening of the second day, I was sitting near the courtyard pond, feeding crumbs to the fish, when the loud sound of horses suddenly echoed through the gates. My head immediately snapped up. The soldiers had returned. Servants quickly hurried toward the entrance as the large gates opened, and then I saw him. Lord Kale rode into the courtyard with several soldiers behind him, his posture still straight and dignified as always. But something immediately caught my attention. His right hand was wrapped in rough bandages. My brows immediately furrowed. What happened to his hand? The soldiers dismounted, and Lord Kale stepped down from his horse. Even though his expression remained calm, I could clearly see faint traces of dried blood along the cloth wrapped around his hand. Before I even realized it, I was already walking toward him. "My lord," one of the servants said nervously, "your injury." "I'm fine," Lord Kale replied calmly. "That's not true. That bandage looked like someone had wrapped it while running away from a battlefield." I crossed my arms and stared at his hand. "That looks terrible." Lord Kale looked at me, clearly surprised that I had approached him so quickly. "It's only a small injury." I raised an eyebrow. "If that's a small injury, I'd hate to see what you consider serious." Before he could argue, I grabbed his wrist. The servants gasped slightly, but I ignored them. "Come with me," I said firmly. Lord Kale didn't resist. In fact, he followed quietly inside the room. I sat him down and carefully unwrapped the bandage. The moment the cloth came off, I frowned. The wound was deeper than I expected. "Who wrapped this?" I muttered. "A soldier. Remind me to scold him later." Lord Kale chuckled softly. I cleaned the wound carefully with warm water and herbs the servants brought, my movements slow and careful so I wouldn't hurt him further. For a while, neither of us spoke, but I could feel his gaze on me the entire time. "Why are you looking at me like that?" I muttered. "You seem very concerned." I paused for a moment, then quickly looked away. "I just don't want people saying the ghost general died from a badly wrapped hand after marrying me." He laughed quietly. It was a warm sound. Once I finished treating the injury, I wrapped his hand again, this time properly. "There," I said. "Try not to fight another war tomorrow." "I'll try," he said quietly. From that night onward, something slowly changed between us. I started cooking sometimes. At first, the servants panicked when they saw me in the kitchen, but eventually they accepted that I enjoyed preparing small meals for him. Whenever Lord Kale returned from training or meetings, there would usually be something waiting for him: soup, steamed buns, roasted meat. Sometimes I would sit beside him while he ate, pretending I wasn't watching him closely. And somehow, little by little, the distance between us disappeared. The mansion that once felt empty now felt warm. One evening, after handing him a bowl of soup, I leaned closer and quickly pressed a small kiss against his cheek before pulling away. Lord Kale froze. I pretended nothing happened, but from the corner of my eye, I could see his ears turning slightly red. After that, it became a habit: a quick peck on his cheek when he returned, another when he finished eating, sometimes just because I felt like it. Somewhere along the way, without even realizing when it happened, I stopped thinking of this marriage as something forced upon me. Instead, I began to think of it as something I had chosen, because the man everyone feared as the Ghost General was actually the gentlest person I had ever met. And before I knew it, I had completely fallen in love with my husband. After a few more peaceful days, life in the Ghost General's mansion had started to feel surprisingly normal. I cooked sometimes, he trained with his soldiers, and in the evenings we would sit together under the lanterns while the night breeze carried the scent of flowers through the courtyard. If someone had told me weeks ago that I would willingly sit beside the feared Ghost General while feeding him soup I made myself, I would have laughed in their face. Yet here I was, breathing the same air as him. One quiet morning, Lord Kale suddenly said, "We should visit your parents." The idea made my heart jump slightly, not because I didn't want to see them, but because the last time my parents saw me, I was practically plotting ways to escape this marriage. Soon a luxurious carriage was prepared, and we rode together through the capital streets. Even though I had ridden beside Lord Kale before, my heart still beat faster whenever we sat so close together. The man had an unfair ability to make my brain forget how to behave properly. Eventually, the carriage arrived in front of my family's mansion. The moment the servants announced our arrival, the entire courtyard became lively. My parents came out to greet us personally. The look on their faces when they saw Lord Kale and I stepping down from the carriage together was priceless. My father tried to maintain his usual dignified composure, but the surprise was clearly written all over his face. My mother, however, looked like she might cry happy tears. "Elias," she exclaimed softly as she hurried toward us. Before I could react, she grabbed my hand and squeezed it affectionately. "I'm so happy to see you both together like this." I awkwardly scratched the back of my head. "We're just visiting." But she was already smiling warmly at Lord Kale. "I'm glad you two are getting closer." The servants quickly prepared a large banquet table inside the hall, just like they used to whenever important guests visited. Bowls of steaming dishes filled the long table within minutes. My mother clearly hadn't forgotten how much I liked food. We all sat down together, and the atmosphere was surprisingly relaxed. For once, no one looked like they were expecting me to start embarrassing the entire family again, which was probably a good thing. As the meal went on, my mother suddenly smiled mischievously. "You know," she said lightly, "if things continue like this, we might soon hear good news." I looked up from my bowl. "What good news?" She glanced between Lord Kale and me with a bright smile. "Grandchildren, of course." I nearly choked on my food. My father coughed quietly into his sleeve, but my mother continued happily. "Your eldest brother already has 3 sons," she said proudly. "And your second brother has twins, a boy and a girl." She looked at us expectantly. "So aside from your 2 other unmarried brothers, the next joyful news should come from you." Several servants nearby nodded eagerly. "We pray the young master will soon hear the cries of a healthy child," one of them added happily. I slowly turned my head toward Lord Kale. He was smiling. I rolled my eyes dramatically. "That is way too early," I said flatly. Everyone looked at me. I waved my chopsticks slightly. We literally just started bonding. My mother laughed softly while the servants continued whispering hopeful blessings. Meanwhile, Lord Kale simply sat there with that calm smile on his face, as if the idea didn't bother him at all. I narrowed my eyes at him. The ghost general might have conquered battlefields across the kingdom, but I had a feeling surviving my family's expectations might be his greatest challenge yet. Before we left my family's mansion, my mother insisted on giving us something. She returned with a beautifully sealed wine jar wrapped in red silk, the kind of wine that noble families usually kept for special occasions. "This is to celebrate your bonding," she said with a bright smile. The servants accompanying Lord Kale accepted the gift respectfully, carefully placing it inside the carriage. My mother squeezed my hand one last time before we left. "Take good care of each other." I rolled my eyes a little at how emotional she sounded, but I still hugged her lightly. All right, I said. "I'll come visit again soon." My father gave Lord Kale a respectful nod, and soon we climbed back into the carriage. By the time we returned to the mansion, the sun had already disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving the night sky calm and clear. Later that evening, Lord Kale and I sat together in the courtyard. The lanterns glowed softly around us, and the moon hung quietly above the rooftops, casting silver light across the garden. It was one of those peaceful nights where the entire world seemed to slow down. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Lord Kale finally broke the silence. "Elias." I turned my head slightly. He looked at me calmly before asking the question, "Why were you so afraid of me at first?" I scoffed immediately. "You finally ask?" He chuckled quietly. I leaned back slightly, folding my arms. "You're the most feared alpha general in the entire territory," I said. "Of course people are afraid of you." I glanced at him. "Every story people told about you made you sound like some terrifying war demon." Lord Kale raised an eyebrow. "War demon? Well, maybe not exactly those words," I admitted. "But the rumors were close enough." I sighed softly. "When I first heard that I was going to marry you, I was honestly terrified. The memory made me shake my head. That's why I tried to ruin the marriage at first." Lord Kale listened quietly without interrupting. Then he spoke. "When I was young, my friends often mocked me." I blinked. "Mocked you?" He nodded slightly. "They said I was too soft." I stared at him. The image of the feared ghost general being teased for being gentle was almost impossible to imagine. But my father changed that. Lord Kale continued, his voice calm, but with quiet respect in his tone. "He taught me that strength doesn't mean cruelty. He said a man must be strong enough to stand up and fight when the people he loves are in danger." That lesson stayed with me. The moonlight reflected softly in his eyes as he spoke. He looked at me again. "I may look cold and distant to others, but I am softer than people think." For a moment, I didn't say anything. Then I smiled. Without thinking too much about it, I leaned closer and rested my head gently on his shoulder. "That's good," I said softly, because somehow hearing that made my chest feel warm. After that, Lord Kale opened the wine my mother had given us. The rich scent filled the air as he poured it into 2 small cups. We drank together under the moonlight. At first we spoke quietly, then we laughed, and somehow, cup after cup, the wine began to make the night feel warm. Soon I found myself giggling over things that probably weren't even funny. Lord Kale wasn't much better, though he tried to stay composed. The slight curve of his smile told me the wine had gotten to him too. By the time the jar was nearly empty, the courtyard lanterns seemed to sway slightly in my vision. "Elias," Lord Kale said softly. I looked at him, though everything felt pleasantly blurry. The next thing I knew, he had lifted me into his arms. I laughed weakly. "I can walk." "You're drunk," he said calmly, and carried me inside anyway. The world felt warm and slow as he brought me into the bedroom. Then, as he gently set me down, I felt his hand brush my cheek, and before I could say anything else, his lips touched mine. For a moment, my mind went completely blank. The warmth of the wine, the quiet night, the gentle closeness between us, everything seemed to blur together. And the rest was history. 3 weeks after that night, I began to notice something strange. At first it was only fatigue, a slight dizziness when I stood too quickly, a heaviness in my body that made even simple movements feel slower than usual. I tried to ignore it, but Lord Kale noticed before I did. He had been summoned away by the Queen Mother for an important military matter, leaving the mansion unusually quiet again, and I told myself I was fine until I wasn't. One morning, I collapsed back onto the bed after standing up, and that was when my mother arrived in a panic. She came rushing into the mansion the moment she heard I was unwell, my father right behind her with a physician in tow. "Elias," my mother called immediately, taking my hand as I sat on the bed, trying to look less miserable than I felt. "I'm fine," I insisted weakly. But the physician stepped forward calmly. After a careful examination, the room fell silent. Then he spoke. "Young Master Elias is about 1 week pregnant." For a moment, I thought I hadn't heard correctly. "Excuse me." The physician nodded again. "Congratulations." Then my mother gasped in pure joy. "I knew it," she almost shouted, grabbing my hand tightly. My father, though quieter, looked visibly relieved. But I just sat there frozen, pregnant. That word repeated in my mind again and again. I slowly looked up. "Are you sure?" I asked the physician carefully. He nodded without hesitation. And that was when something clicked in my memory. The night under the moonlight, the wine, soft laughs, and a single moment where everything else faded away. I slowly turned my head toward my mother. "That wine," I said slowly. She smiled. I narrowed my eyes. "You said it was just a gift." "It was a bonding wine," she replied cheerfully. I stared at her. "You are full of surprises, mother." She only laughed softly, clearly not regretting anything. And somehow, despite everything, I couldn't even stay angry. A letter was immediately sent to Lord Kale, and for the first time since I met him, I found myself waiting. 2 days later, he returned without delay. The moment he stepped into the mansion and saw me, his expression softened instantly, and when he heard the news, he was overjoyed. He simply walked toward me, took my hand, and spoke in a steady voice. "I will not leave again." I blinked. "Are you sure about that? What about the Queen Mother's assignment?" "She can wait," he said. "I have to stay here and protect the ones I love." Something in my chest tightened at those words. From that day onward, Lord Kale stayed by my side, always close, always watching over me. As the months passed, my body changed gently with time, and every morning I would wake to find him either sitting nearby reading reports or quietly preparing food for me. Despite having tons of servants, the ghost general of the empire had become something else entirely. Inside our home, he was a husband, a protector, and a man waiting for his family to grow. On the day our baby was born, the entire capital seemed to celebrate as if the heavens themselves had blessed the empire. Drums echoed through the city, lanterns filled the streets. Even the Queen Mother and the young king personally sent blessings and gifts, declaring the birth of our child a sign of great fortune for the kingdom. In my arms, I held a small baby boy. My husband, Lord Kale, stood beside me, smiling brightly as he looked down at our child. I exhaled softly. "We have a family now." He nodded. "We named our baby Kalen Thornblackwood, a name that carried both our lineages, a symbol of the bond we had built from fear, misunderstanding, and finally, profound love. My small, beautiful family was now complete, and for that, I was deeply grateful. Months turned into seasons, and our son, Kalen, grew from a tiny, squalling bundle into a curious, chubby-cheeked toddler who seemed determined to explore every corner of the mansion. His eyes, gray like his father's, sparkled with mischief, and his laugh echoed through the courtyards like wind chimes on a summer morning. I often found myself watching him with a mixture of pride and disbelief. This small, perfect creature was proof that my marriage to the ghost general had become something I never dared to dream of, a true family. Lord Kale, or rather, my husband, had softened in ways that would have made his soldiers gape in astonishment. He still commanded armies with cold precision, still returned from meetings with that sharp, unreadable expression that made ministers tremble. But the moment he stepped through our gates, he transformed. He would scoop Kalen into his arms, spin him around until the boy shrieked with laughter, and then carry him to the kitchen to find whatever snack I had prepared. The servants had long stopped whispering about the ghost general's strange behavior. They had grown used to their master's hidden tenderness. One crisp autumn afternoon, I was in the garden teaching Kalen how to gently pat the head of a sleepy cat that had wandered into our courtyard. The cat, a ginger tabby with a crooked ear, had appeared a week earlier and decided our mansion was its new home. I had named it Machi because it was round and soft and always seemed to be napping. "Gentle sweetheart," I said, guiding Kalen's small hand. "Like this, soft, soft." Kalen giggled and patted Machi with exaggerated care, his tiny fingers barely brushing the fur. Machi purred and rolled over, exposing its belly, a sign of absolute trust that made my heart swell. "You're a natural with animals," came a deep voice from behind me. I turned to find Lord Kale standing at the garden arch, still in his formal robes from a morning audience with the Queen Mother. His hair was slightly disheveled, and there was a tiredness in his eyes that spoke of long hours of courtly debate. But his smile, that rare, unguarded smile he reserved only for us, was bright. "And you're back early," I said, standing and brushing dirt from my robes. "I thought the Queen Mother's meetings always stretched past noon." "They do," he replied, walking toward us. He knelt beside Kalen and ruffled the boy's hair. "But I told her I had a very important engagement at home, feeding a certain someone his afternoon soup." Kalen immediately perked up. "Soup? Soup, Papa?" I laughed. "You see what you've done? Now he won't eat anything else until you serve it yourself." Lord Kale scooped our son into his arms, and we walked together toward the kitchen. As we passed the lotus pond, I caught him glancing at me with that warm, searching look that still made my stomach flutter. "What?" I asked. "Nothing," he said. "Just thinking how lucky I am." I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't stop the smile that spread across my face. "You're getting soft, General." "Only for you," he murmured, and with Kalen squirming between us, he leaned over and pressed a quick kiss to my temple. That evening, after Kalen had been put to bed and the mansion had grown quiet, Lord Kale and I sat in our favorite spot, the wooden pavilion overlooking the garden. The autumn moon hung low and full, casting silver light on the chrysanthemums that bloomed in neat rows. A pot of warm tea sat between us, and Machi had curled up on my lap, purring like a tiny engine. "The Queen Mother mentioned something today," Lord Kale said, his tone carefully neutral. I raised an eyebrow. "That never sounds good." "She wants to host a banquet at the palace, to formally acknowledge Kalen as the heir of the Blackwood household. She said it's tradition, and it would strengthen our family's position in the court." I groaned. "A banquet? With all those nobles staring and whispering and judging my every move? Do I have to attend?" "You're his father." "Of course you do." He reached over and took my hand. "But I'll be beside you the entire time. And if anyone so much as looks at you wrong, I'll remind them exactly why I earned my reputation." I snorted. "You can't threaten the entire nobility, Kale." "Watch me." Despite my protests, I knew he was serious, and that made me love him even more. We talked for a while longer about the banquet arrangements, about Kalen's upcoming first birthday, about the new silk robes I would need to have made. It was ordinary, domestic conversation, and yet, sitting there under the moonlight with my alpha's hand in mine, I felt a contentment I had never known. The banquet was held 2 weeks later, and as I had feared, it was an elaborate affair. The palace halls were draped in crimson and gold, hundreds of candles flickered in ornate holders, and the scent of roasted meats and exotic spices filled every corner. Nobles from across the kingdom had gathered to honor the ghost general's son, a political move as much as a celebration. I wore my finest robes, deep emerald silk embroidered with silver cranes, a set of jade hairpins that Lord Kale had given me as a gift, and the subtle hint of my mate's scent lingering on my skin. Kalen, dressed in miniature robes of matching green, sat on Lord Kale's lap, looking around with wide, curious eyes. The Queen Mother presided over the feast from her elevated throne, her expression unreadable. She had always been kind to me, but I never quite shook the feeling that she was assessing me, measuring whether I was worthy of her favorite general. Halfway through the meal, as the servants brought out a second course of honeyed duck, a young nobleman from a southern family raised his cup and said loudly, "To the ghost general and his lovely Omega. May their son grow to be as fierce as his father and as beautiful as his mother." I froze. Mother? Lord Kale's expression went cold. The room's chatter faltered. I set down my chopsticks and smiled sweetly at the nobleman. I'm not his mother. I'm his father. But I appreciate the compliment to my beauty. The nobleman's face turned crimson. I meant no offense, my lord. You simply spoke without thinking. Lord Kale cut in, his voice dangerously soft. My husband is an Omega, yes, but he is also a man. I expect you to remember that. The nobleman stammered an apology and retreated into his cup. The Queen Mother observed the exchange with a flicker of amusement, then raised her goblet. To Lord Elias, then, a father as brave as any warrior, for he has tamed the wildest heart in our kingdom. Laughter rippled through the hall, and the tension dissolved. I shot a grateful look at the Queen Mother, who gave me a subtle nod. Despite her intimidating presence, she had always supported our marriage, perhaps because she knew Lord Kale's happiness was tied to mine. Later that night, as we rode home in our carriage with a sleeping Kalen between us, I leaned against Lord Kale's shoulder. You didn't have to threaten the nobleman like that. Yes, I did. He wrapped an arm around me. No one will ever diminish you, Elias, not in my presence, and not in yours. I closed my eyes and breathed in his scent, cedar, night air, and the faint musk of alpha warmth. I love you, I murmured. And I love you, he replied, more than all the stars in the sky. Winter came, bringing snow that blanketed the capital in white. Kalen had his first birthday, a modest celebration with just our family and a few close friends. My mother baked a towering cake. My father presented a wooden toy sword he had commissioned from a master craftsman, and Lord Kale spent the entire day playing with our son in the snow, building lopsided snowmen and chasing each other across the courtyard. I watched from the covered porch, wrapped in a thick fur cloak, Machi at my feet. The sight of my fearsome husband, the ghost general, laughing like a child as he threw snowballs at Kalen filled me with a joy so profound it almost hurt. You're missing the fun, Lord Kale called out, his breath misting in the cold air. I'm supervising, I replied with a grin. He jogged over, snow clinging to his robes, and his cheeks flushed from the cold. He pulled me into a tight embrace, pressing his cold nose against my neck. I squealed and tried to push him away, but he held on. You're freezing, I complained. Then warm me up. He kissed my ear, and I melted despite the chill. That night, after Kalen had been tucked in and the fire crackled warmly in our chamber, Lord Kale and I lay tangled together, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my back. I never imagined I could have this, he said quietly. A home, a family, someone who sees me. Not the general, not the monster, but just me. I propped myself up on one elbow and looked at him. His gray eyes were soft in the firelight, vulnerable in a way that he never showed anyone else. I never imagined I would want this, I admitted. When I first heard about the marriage, I thought my life was over. Instead, it was just beginning. He pulled me closer and kissed me slowly, deeply. Thank you, he whispered. For what? For giving me a chance. For staying. For being everything I didn't know I needed. I smiled against his lips. You're welcome, but you're the one who never gave up on me. Even when I stole food from your chopsticks and acted like a complete fool. He laughed, that warm, unguarded laugh that still made my heart skip. That was the moment I knew I would never let you go. Why? Because I was so embarrassing. Because you were real, he said. Everyone else bows and scrapes and tells me what they think I want to hear. You walked in, treated me like I was just a man, and made me laugh. I knew then I had to have you. I kissed him again, and the fire crackled, and outside the window, snow continued to fall softly over the Capitol, over the palace, over the mansion, over the world we had built together. Spring arrived, bringing new life to the gardens. Kalen took his first steps, a wobbly, determined march across the courtyard that ended in his father's outstretched arms. Lord Kale lifted him high, shouting with pride, and I wept happy tears behind my sleeve. We also welcomed a new addition to our household, a sleek, black-furred puppy with floppy ears and an endless supply of energy. The servants groaned at the extra work, but Kalen adored the creature, naming it Shadow with all the seriousness a toddler could muster. Lord Kale protested that we didn't need another pet, but I caught him sneaking treats to Shadow when he thought no one was watching. And in the quiet moments, when the sun set over the lotus pond, when Kalen fell asleep in my arms, when Lord Kale rested his head on my shoulder and sighed contentedly, I knew that this was where I belonged. Not as the perfect omega of my family's reputation, not as the reluctant spouse of a feared general, but as Elias, husband, father, and the man who had found love in the most unexpected place. The ghost general had melted the ice around my heart, and I had melted his in return. Together, we were unstoppable,